Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Denise Amber Lee Foundation Wednesday webinar. We're so excited to have Jeanette Sullivan here today to present us with her topic about how to navigate domestic violence calls. I see a lot of familiar names in the registration list, so thank you guys for joining us once again. And for those of you that are new, welcome as well. The Denise Amber Lee Foundation was founded by Denise's husband, Nathan Lee, in June of 2008. 6 months after her tragic death. The foundation's mission is to help 911 centers across the country to avoid a similar occurrence to someone else. We work to support public safety through uniform training, standardized protocols, quality assurance, and technological advances to 911. The foundation offers on-site and online courses, third-party quality assurance services, as well as other opportunities throughout the year, including our monthly Wednesday webinar. For more information, please email info@deniseamberlee.org. Following the webinar, we'll be sending out a certificate and a link to the replay, and we'll also be uploading today's webinar to YouTube for easy access. Today's speaker is someone that I've had the privilege of having speak 4 times within the last year and present, and every time that I get to listen to her, it's so impactful and such a great reminder about why our role in domestic violence calls is so important. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jeanette for today's presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Super excited to be presenting today. We're going to be talking about domestic violence calls. We're going to be talking about kind of some of those dynamics. And I would love it if, as a favor to me, if you guys can just put in the chat, maybe like where you hail from, where maybe you, maybe how much experience you have if you are a dispatcher, or if you have maybe a complementary role. I would just love to get kind of a ballpark idea of who I'm talking to as we go through this session. Just a little bit about me, if I can advance my slide. A little bit about me. I have been a part of dispatch centers for just over 20 years. I've had the role of dispatcher, communications training officer. I was a supervisor for several years. And then I'm currently in the role of a reserve dispatcher. So I have been reserve dispatching for a couple of years as I have moved to more of a policy and accreditation role. I've also spent about the last 10 years teaching domestic violence to dispatchers as well as to advocates. And I'm currently in a policy and accreditation role at Cedar Park Police Department, which is in Central Texas. So super glad to be here today. Just looking at some of the comments, looks like I've got folks from all over the place. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Hopefully this will be a really, interesting and impactful class for you guys. I will have some opportunities for you guys to, kind of pitch in and help me along with some of these topics. And just, let me know if I'm missing anything. So some of the things that we're going to cover today, we're going to talk briefly we're going to take a broad view of kind of what domestic violence is. I would like to also talk a little bit about why their stories are important for us within the context of a communications division environment, taking 911 calls, why the stories of our domestic violence callers matter. I see a lot of you guys who are commenting about where you're from have, significant amount of time in dispatch centers. So some of this is going to be hopefully some new information for you guys. And hopefully you guys can kind of add some to some of the challenges that we're experiencing in the comm center. I want to look at what the goal of call processing looks like when we're talking about domestic violence calls. And then maybe that's not quite exactly what it is in some of the other calls. And then we're going to talk just kind of briefly as we wrap up the session today about what it means to really hit the mark and kind of get a win in these situations and what we can kind of do to help increase reliability in our dispatch centers when we're talking about the domestic violence calls.
Hey, Jeanette, I'm sorry. It looks like your presentation isn't showing up on the screen. You may have to turn off the screen share and then turn it back on again.
Oh, okay. So let me try that.
There it is. Perfect.
Okay, so you can see it now. Just holler if anything changes. So just a couple of domestic violence statistics. I got these from the National Domestic Violence Coalition. So 1 in 4 women experience severe assault by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And a severe assault is defined by them as strangulation, severe incidents of stalking, some sort of serious bodily injury. So this is not just like a domestic violent relationship. This is one where severe assault has occurred. And then the statistics for men are 1 in 7. And then because we're talking to dispatchers, there's about 20,000 phone calls that are made on a typical day to the domestic violence hotlines nationwide. And so, think about how many calls you get within your communications center, and imagine that those numbers being multiplied nationwide for people that are experiencing domestic violence crisis. I think the average is something like every 2 minutes or every 30 seconds, someone in the United States is assaulted. So this is a huge issue that does not just happen in a vacuum. When you guys think about your domestic violence, when you guys think about your communication centers, think about how many female dispatchers you have. Think about how many male dispatchers you have. And think about statistically the possibility that one of the people in your own communication center, maybe even one of the officers that you work with, may be a victim of domestic violence. This is something that does not impact only one particular group of people. And we're going to talk about kind of what it looks like because, I think I just shut my screen off. Hang on just a second. Sorry about that. I don't know how I actually closed that.
There it is.
All right. Sorry about that, guys. So this is the power and control wheel. If you are familiar with the power and control wheel, if this is something that you have seen before, then I would love it if you guys can put in the chat some of the examples of what some of these things look like. And I'll give you guys a really good example using economic abuse. So most of what domestic violence is kind of happens within the context of this power and control wheel. For a lot of years when we were teaching about domestic violence, we used what we called the cycle of violence. And so the cycle of violence would be, you would have a honeymoon stage, and then you would have a buildup. You'd have we would call it the tension building. And then you would have some explosive incident, which sometimes an assault occurred. And then once that happened, you would kind of circle back and you would go back to the honeymoon stage. And so for a really long time, the way we described domestic violence was this cycle that would just kind of repeat itself over and over and over again. You'd have honeymoon, tension building, explosion, back to honeymoon. As we talked with domestic violence survivors, as we talked with people who were able to escape from these relationships, what we found is that it was much more kind of like spokes on a wheel, and it was much more a variety of different things occurring to people over an extended period of time that sort of helped shift the way that it shifted the way that they thought about themselves, the relationship that they were in, their level of responsibility in a particular situation. So as an example, if you look at economic abuse is when somebody is controlling finances in some way. So what that could look like is a person who is in a relationship saying, I'm going to control the finances. And sometimes the reasons that they give in and of themselves are not problematic. Hey, I'm really good with money. I'm going to handle all of the finances. I want you to be able to, you go focus on what you're doing. I'll make sure we stay okay. I'll make sure all the bills get paid. But it may turn into, well, you're not reliable. I can't trust you with the money. Or here is your allowance. And so economic abuse is when that behavior, when that, idea of controlling somebody's financial situation, when they're using that as a technique to control, manipulate, exert power over another person. So we've seen survivors of domestic violence who had difficulty leaving a situation because the person that they were married to controlled 100% of the finances. they were the only persons who were on the bank account. And so, our victims who are in the process of maybe trying to leave a marriage, where maybe even they've been working and have been working for some time, even if they're working and making their own income, in a situation where economic abuse is being implemented, they may not have any of the funds. They may not even know how much money they have in the bank account because they're not allowed that access. So that's kind of what power and control in the economic abuse can look like. I want to go through a couple more of these because I think it's really critical that we in dispatch kind of wrap our head around what is going on behind the scenes during a domestic violence call. When we get that initial call, we're listening to a snapshot of something that potentially has been occurring to our victims for a very long time. So not only do we see economic abuse, but we also see emotional abuse. Emotional abuse can just be insults or, put downs, insulting the way that somebody looks, maybe even the way somebody's dressed, something that kind of slowly over time becomes repeated and repeated and repeated. And so eventually when you hear an insult, or when you hear somebody make comments about the way you're dressed, the way you look, even insults like you're stupid, you're lucky, nobody wants to be with you except for me, you should feel so lucky that I'm willing to put up with you, things like that. When you hear those things repeated over and over and over and over again, it becomes very difficult to argue with them. And I think that is especially important when you also look at isolation, which is another one of the techniques that abusers will use. Isolation, in my opinion, is one of the worst pieces of this puzzle because isolation is pulling you away from everybody in your life that loves you and cares about you and that will speak truth to you, right? We all have community, or we should have community. Community is an important part of the human experience. It's what allows us to connect with other people, see different perspectives. And that's something that, sometimes we've struggled with, especially in COVID. And especially over the last couple of years, as our culture has kind of shifted, so much of what we do now is online instead of in person. And so that can affect us regardless of what role we have. When we are a domestic violence victim, that isolation can look not only like, hey, we're not going to go do this fun thing with your family. It also could look like over time, slowly destroying that relationship that you may have with your family. Abusers' primary goal is to control the situation and to have power in that. And if they're challenged by a family member who maybe sees them acting a certain way and calls them out on it, then that would challenge their power. And so abusers, knowing that what they're doing is wrong, will seek to isolate their victims away from anybody who would question what they're doing. And so over time, this obviously doesn't happen overnight, right? If you go on the first date with somebody and you walk into, maybe it's the Chili's restaurant. If you walk into Chili's and you're on your very first date with somebody and they slap you and tell you that you're never allowed to speak to your mom again, you're going to leave, right? Nobody is going to go into the situation and say, that sounds like a reasonable response to this relationship. But what happens is they come in and our abusers are Prince Charming. And our abusers very quickly try and hook them in. And we've all experienced the thrill of that early relationship, right? We've all experienced that excitement, that hope, and that possibility of love and of connection with another human. And so it's very easy in those early stages to be hyper-focused on them, right? To say, I would love to spend all of my time with you. So abusers will take advantage of that and they'll abuse that, right? It's not, sometimes that's healthy, right? There's a healthy level of that. And then there's also healthy levels of autonomy, of relationships outside of your primary relationship with the person that you love and care and you've chosen to care about. And so the way that this ends up playing out is over time, they say, hey, I know you were going to go hang out with your mom. I would just really, I really wanted to spend some time with you. I've been so busy at work. I really miss you. Can you hang out with me instead? Maybe go hang out with your mom next week. And so they slowly will start to very reasonably make requests that allow them more power and more control and more influence. And again, it happens slowly, right? Nobody goes into that relationship and gets assaulted on day one and sticks around. They have to slowly build a case for that abuse being justified. And so that's where isolation comes in, because over time, before you know it, you're no longer talking to your friends, you're no longer talking to your family members, because everything you have become has become wrapped up in your abuser. And when your abuser controls the narrative, then the things like the emotional abuse become that much more powerful and that much more impactful on our victims. This is where we see things like minimizing, denying, and blaming happen. This is where an abuser will diminish your feelings when you go to them and you say, hey, I've been hurt by XYZ behavior. Well, it's really not that big of a deal. You're being too sensitive is a common response. And over time, that can become something that we in our communication centers see when our domestic violence victims call us. And so they can call us and they can immediately ask for help, right? We've all kind of gotten those phone calls. Hey, I need help. I'm in a domestic violence situation. So-and-so's assaulted me. The line disconnects. And 5 minutes later, they call back. And the story that they give us is, hey, I need to cancel you guys. It actually really wasn't physical. Everything's going fine. I'm sorry. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to call. Can we please cancel this response? I know you guys can't do show of hands, but I mean, how many of us has that happened to, right? So what's going on there? Part of what's going on there is that they are also minimizing, denying, and blaming, right? They're taking the blame onto themselves. I have story after story of domestic violence victim who says, I felt like I wasn't worth the dirt on his shoes. I was so convinced that everything I had become was the problem. There's a survivor by the name of Susan Still. You can watch some of her videos. She's been on Oprah before. She was also on 2020. But Susan Still's story as a domestic violence survivor has a lot of these dynamics, right? She really felt like she was the primary problem. And her abuser, her husband at the time, he used his privilege as the head of the family to control much of what happened. She was the primary breadwinner. He controlled all the finances. He controlled the children. She once got beat because she had been given a rule by her abuser that she wasn't allowed to hug and kiss the children, right? And so that gets us around to using the children. So there's example after example after example of situations where any number of these things in and of themselves can be used to start to establish control. And then over time, our abusers will continue to escalate and continue to escalate and continue to escalate until finally we get to criminal offense. One of the things I would love for you guys to take away from this conversation today is that there are two pieces of that pie chart that I have not talked about yet. I haven't talked about intimidation, and I haven't talked about coercion or threats. That's because those other 6 pieces of that pie chart, none of those things are criminal offenses. If we get a phone call that comes into our communication center and somebody says, I would like to file a police report because my husband told me that I was a stupid idiot, we won't process that call, right? Maybe we will. Maybe we'll have an officer call them. Maybe we will have some sort of follow-up. Maybe we'll ask some more questions, right? But everybody in this webinar today, we all know that it's not against the law. There's no criminal offense in saying somebody is stupid, right? It's very rude. It's very disrespectful. If somebody calls 911 and they say, I need to file a police report because my husband, the father of my children, well, he's taken my son and checked into a hotel with him, and I don't want him to do that. He's kidnapped my child. Well, who's the parent? Well, him and I are both the parents. Well, I can't speak for you guys' states, but in Texas, if it's 2 different parents and there's no court order in place saying otherwise, then they both have equal right to that child. And so in those cases, I have no criminal offense. When we get to coercion, when we get to threats, when we get to intimidation, which in Texas, intimidation could look like blocking somebody from a doorway. Maybe they're trying to leave a house and get help, and you're standing there like this, and you're blocking the door. Something like that. Those are criminal offenses. But the line between what is not criminal and what is criminal is very vague for our abuse victims. And they have been inundated with the isolation and the emotional abuse and the minimizing and the dying and the blaming. And they've been inundated with all of that. And there's so many concerns and fears about the children and maybe the finances, that by the time they get to the coercion or threats, by the time they get to the physical abuse, right, by the time they get to the strangulation, the abuse is justified in their mind and in the mind of the abuser. They've become so normalized that they believe, well, he wouldn't have to hit me if I would have just behaved. He wouldn't have to hit me if I had had dinner done on time. It's my fault that he's screaming in a rage right now because I didn't pay that bill that he wanted me to pay. Whatever the reason may be, however they're in that relationship, however it's been justified to our victims, they feel that what is occurring to them is justified, which is oftentimes why we see the secondary calls where they cancel or they try and cover things up. So that's just kind of like a broad overview on kind of what the power and control wheel looks like. And so we have to understand that when we take these phone calls and we think to ourselves, why don't they just leave? Why doesn't this person, leave this relationship? That there's a lot of barriers and there's a lot of risks that are associated with that relationship. I know not everybody does this or wants to admit it, but I will be the first to admit that until I really learned about domestic violence, I used to have frequent flyers who would call into our communications center. And I'm going to obviously change details to protect protect who they are. But, I would have people call in and they would call in, every Friday night in the middle of a domestic violence situation. And I didn't have the understanding of what was going on behind the scenes, the problems and the difficulties that our victim would have had in leaving. And so week after week after week, I witnessed this person call in with a disturbance. And sometimes they were calling and sometimes the spouse was calling. Usually somebody was intoxicated or under the influence of something. The stories were never super consistent. Sometimes people would get arrested. Sometimes we would just have them separate for the night. But I remember that call coming in week after week after week after week after week. And I did get frustrated. And I did think to myself, why would this person stay in this relationship? I wouldn't stay. I wouldn't stay in this relationship. It's complete crazy. Why would they do this to themselves? They're putting up with this terrible, horrible situation. And I really did think that. And I think a lot of us, if we're honest, a lot of us have had those same thoughts, right? Because it's creating a gap in our understanding. And as dispatchers, right, we want to be really good at our job. We want to know what's going on. We want bad guys to go to jail. And we want to get as much information as we can because that's what we've been trained to do. And 95% of the time, we're super great at it. But these calls are difficult for us because there's a lot of unknowns. And what we put in that gap matters. And so when we don't have a full understanding of maybe why this is occurring, maybe what some of the statistics tell us about it, it can make it very difficult for us to push through and to put some trust into that gap, to understand that our victims are kind of doing the best that they can with what they've got available to them in a lot of these cases. So some of the barriers, financial ability to leave. There's something called reproductive coercion that we see in domestic violence cases where an abuser forces their partner to stay pregnant, having kid after kid after kid, because as some of you guys will know who have done research on, the cost of childcare anywhere in the United States right now, it is very expensive to have somebody hired to take care of your children while you go to work. And so if you're trying to leave a violent relationship and you're looking at having to put 3 kids under the age of 5 into daycare, there's not a lot of jobs you can get that will be able to pay the cost of 3 kids in daycare and pay enough for you to have, rent and bills and groceries and all of those other things. So there may be a financial inability for them to leave. In some of our cases, we have some people who, even locally in our area, maybe they have a job and maybe they have enough money that they theoretically could leave, but their partner controls all the finances and has said, if you leave, I'm going to empty that bank account. You'll never see a dime. Well, if they've got the sole control of that bank account because they've been controlling it, then that may be a real barrier for our victims. There also may be a risk to children. It may be that somebody's made threats. If you leave me, I'll leave the country. You'll never see the children again. Right? We see that sometimes in our immigrant communities. It also may be, I'll tell the judge XYZ, you won't get custody, right? Or in situations where we have male victims, they may know that the court system is likely to side with the mom in a situation. And if the mother is the abuser, that may cause hesitation on their part to leave because they don't want to leave the kids alone. And so children being involved in a situation add quite a bit of extra complexity to any given situation. The violence is also oftentimes not constant. It's difficult to wrap our heads around it if we are not in this situation ourselves. But if you love and care for somebody and you have an idea of what things were and what the possibilities were, and then you've been told that if you could just fix your behavior, all of this abuse would stop, and you are the problem, and you imagine the world of possibilities that once upon a time were happening, it's very difficult to let go of that belief that that is still possible. And so if that violence is not all of the time, I know somebody whose violence only occurred maybe once or twice a year. And once or twice a year of a violent situation and a violent encounter measured against, the fact that they're a good parent, they're a good provider. They take care of the children. They make enough money when they combine their resources. And they're having to measure, do I leave this relationship with this person that I love because of 2 or 3 incidents, right? And that's complex. That's difficult. That's not a decision that anybody can truly make easily. And each person has to make that for themselves. But it does create a barrier for folks. And then again, when we talk about the isolation and the minimization, our abusers sending the message to our victims that they are the problem creates a big barrier for them to leave because they think if they can just fix their behavior, everything will be better. But that's a lie used to control and manipulate them. Not to mention, when we talk about barriers, we also have to consider the risks of leaving. When a person leaves a domestic violence relationship, it oftentimes escalates the violence. It doesn't make it go away. It actually makes it more dangerous for them. And so it's really important when we do get a person who's on the phone, and I could talk about this for hours. I do talk about this for hours in other environments, but just for the sake of today, it's really important for us when we have somebody who is leaving one of these relationships, they are entering one of the most dangerous periods of time. And it's super critical that we get them connected with resources that can do safety planning, that can help keep them safe and can help them avoid situations that they're going to be at a greater risk. So those are really important things for us to kind of just be aware. It doesn't mean you're safe if you stay, right? We have definitely seen that there are lots of folks who get into who are in these relationships who are not in the process of leaving, and there's a fatal outcome. But 75% of the women that are murdered by an intimate partner, they're murdered when they are either leaving or trying to leave. And so it's not necessarily safe if you stay, but it is super dangerous when you're trying to leave. So we have to kind of just be aware that that's part of the possibility. One of the things that I think it's really valuable for us to talk about today is the challenge of these changing stories. I think we don't talk enough about how frustrating this can be for our dispatchers. People have a misunderstanding, I think, about what a domestic violence victim's goal is when they call 911. So think back, for those of us who've been doing this for, I've seen here 22 years, 15 years, 27 years. There's a lot of us who have been in this field for quite a while. So think about, and even for those of you who are newer in public safety, in dispatch, think about what it is that you really enjoy about being a 911 dispatcher, right? For me, one of the things that I really enjoyed was I enjoyed catching bad guys, right? I'm not catching them myself, okay, but I'm helping that process. And so, I remember many times on, mid shift or night shift, getting a report of a theft that just occurred, or, somebody breaking into vehicles, and we track down the bad guy, and, maybe my guys get into a foot pursuit and we catch the bad guy, right? And we have very clear, we have very clear victims, right? And the victims say, heck yeah, put those people in jail. I want them to go to jail. I'll show up to court. I'll do whatever you need. And so we have that. And we have the officer who says, here's the bad guy and here's the very clear crime that they've committed. And it's very black and white, right? And those calls are great. And we would always, we would celebrate, we would cheer, we'd be like, yay, we got the bad guy. Those are great calls. Those are not domestic violence calls. And I think for a really long time, we've never really differentiated between them. And I'm kind of hoping that we can have some conversations about what does that look like to rethink why our domestic violence victims are calling 911. Because if I apply the logic of that burglary or that pursuit that we just had, if I apply the same logic, then when a domestic violence victim calls me, I'm expecting that they want to press charges. Maybe they want to leave the domestic violence situation. Maybe they want shelter information. I can create a million scenarios about what I think the domestic violence victim is calling for. But the majority of them, when they call us, if they're not ready to leave, if they're not ready to have those conversations, but they're still calling us, then they're calling us because they want whatever violence is occurring to stop. And if we look at 911 calls from our domestic violence victims as that, and then we ask this question, what are the consequences of that phone call for our victim? Then I think we can start to help to understand why we see some of the changing stories that we see in our communication centers. They call 911 because they want that violence to stop. They are scared. They're terrified. Anybody who's been doing this for any amount of time, who's talked to domestic violence victims on the other end of the line, we get those domestic violence calls, we can hear the fear in their voice. We can hear the trauma. We can hear the panic. We can hear that they are scared. Well, what happens, right? You fast forward that call, you put your call in for your domestic disturbance. Maybe the line disconnects and you can't reestablish contact. But you remember that that person sounded really panicked and really scared and really afraid. And your officers go on scene and they're out there for 10 or 15 minutes. And then the call clears, and it clears with, verbal only, parties separated, we're back in service. And that there's a tension there between what we heard, the fear that we heard, and what our officers have determined has occurred, right? And there's a changing story that is occurring there. But it's changing because there are some consequences there that we as telecommunicators have not thought about, right? Our domestic violence victims, they have to oftentimes coexist with that abuser regardless of what happens with law enforcement. Maybe there are threats that are being made in the background. Maybe they've been told, if you tell the police what I'm doing, I'll kill our kid, I'll kill the dog, I'll kill you, I'll kill myself. There may be threats like that are going on. They may be afraid of what happens if the person who is abusing them is their primary breadwinner. What happens if that person gets arrested and loses their job, right? There are some consequences, some real world impact that can affect our victims' ability to communicate truthfully and effectively about what is actually going on that scene. And so that leads to a frustration point for us as telecommunicators and as dispatchers, because we're like, well, what is the point of this? Why are you calling us if your story is going to change? Why are you calling us if you're just going to cancel us 5 minutes later? Don't you understand? I'm trying to help you in this situation. I'm trying to help you get out. I'm trying to help you get safe. I'm trying to potentially save your life. Why does your story keep changing? And when we have an absence of information and we're filling in the gap with whatever we've got available to us, we may not be filling that with good information. And so it becomes very challenging for us in dispatch because it makes us question our ability that we're doing our job effectively, that we're really making a difference. So I think what we can start to do is we can start to rethink what the goal is of dispatchers, right? So what is our goal in 911 calls when we're talking to our domestic violence victims. So I made my own little cycle of 911 calls. Instead of a cycle of violence, this is my cycle of domestic violence 911 call taking. So the very first step that we have is the 911 call. So we get a 911 call for help in our communication center, right? And what do we do as dispatchers? We get the information, right? What's the location? What's occurring? Is anybody injured, right? We collect the information, we record it, and we organize it from whoever's in crisis. And I put the person in crisis there intentionally because I think it's important that we consider that the person that we're talking to may be in an active crisis. And if you're in active crisis, you're dealing with the diminished prefrontal cortex, right? That thinking logical part of your brain. If that's diminished, shut down, not functioning because you're in fight, flight, freeze, then the ability you have to give me good information potentially is going to be limited. And so that's something I think that we need to recognize and address. So we collect the information and we send help, right? We dispatch first responders. Maybe we have to address scene safety. Maybe we have to tell them to go somewhere safe. Maybe we have the fire department in the EMS stage so that the police can secure the scene. We do our job and we do it well. So step 4 is really where I want us to start rethinking if we can start to have this conversation, right? Because our goal is to process 911 calls in such a way so that our 911 caller is willing to call us again the next time they're in a crisis. Domestic violence victims are used to being told that, they don't really deserve help, that they're the problem. Their problems are minimized or denied, or they're blamed for it. And so if we in the dispatch center, even unintentionally, if we reaffirm that messaging, if we tell them that they're part of the problem, if we tell them that we're not going to help them unless they talk to us truthfully, if they don't press charges, if we ever imply anything like that, and I'm not saying that we do, right? We really don't. But we have to be kind of aware of what's at risk with these situations, because if we're not having these conversations, if we're not going out of our way to say, I'm so glad that you called, please know you can call us anytime you don't feel safe, and we're here for you and we will send you help, right? If we can have that conversation with them, then they call us back. And then they call us back. And then we can continue that cycle, because the reality of a domestic violence victim's life is that they're probably not going to be ready to leave during that first 911 call. They may not even be ready to leave by the 10th 911 call. And so our goal in dispatch, what we need to drive home to our folks, is that the goal of these calls is not necessarily for us to, force somebody to press charges, force somebody to leave a relationship. We can't make these decisions for them. But what we can do is we can create an environment where they say, I'm really in the middle of a terrible situation, but that dispatcher told me that I could call back if I ever felt unsafe, and I feel unsafe today, so I'm going to call. And maybe one day when they are ready to leave, they will be willing to call us, and then we'll be able to get maybe the suspect information. Maybe we'll be able to get them to cooperate with prosecution, right? All of those steps that happen long after the 911 call is made. Our job is what can we do during that 911 call to make sure that we're not creating additional barriers for our victims to seek help in whatever capacity that they may be capable of it. So we're kind of starting to wind down here. I want to just talk real briefly kind of on how we can kind of increase reliability. And you guys are going to laugh because it basically says the same thing in all of my little spots there, right? So we educate, and we repeat the situation. I thought about talking about some of the challenges in our comm centers, right? Like our staffing levels, or, competitive pay, or people hopping from center to center to center. I thought about having those kind of conversations, but you guys all know that those are some of our challenges, right? Those are nationwide challenges. So we have to kind of take that into consideration when we're talking about what kind of plan to have. And so when I think about dispatch reliability, when I think about how do we do this better and how do we do it more consistently across the nation, I think one is that we educate folks, right? We have conversations like what we're having today, where we talk about domestic violence and we talk about policy and we talk about training. You need to have a policy on domestic violence. If you are a communications center, if you are a law enforcement agency, anything like that, if you are dispatching anybody, you need to have a policy on what you do in these domestic violence situations. set the standard and the expectation, and then train your folks on it. And training can come from a variety of places. Your local victim advocates, your local prosecutor's office, your local SVU detective are great resources, especially if they have a passion for sharing information. So you may have to get a little creative about where you get that training from, but training them on some of these dynamics is super valuable information. You also have to educate them on trauma reactions. Part of what we see in our domestic violence calls is people in active trauma. And people in active trauma, sometimes they're willing to communicate, sometimes they're not able to. And so what do we do with that? Why is that happening? If we can understand that, we can create more capacity to fill that gap in with understanding. And then I think it's also important for us to educate other people on the role of dispatch. That may or may not be something that you undertake as your job, but that just may be having conversations with people about what we're capable of providing, what our expectations and our policies are, and then that will help them understand our role better. And then step 4 is really kind of creating a way for all of this to become part of an ongoing program. Because we have such issues with retention, because we have so much turnover, because people just forget sometimes. We have to create an environment where this is an ongoing conversation, not just something that, I saw this webinar, everybody go watch the webinar. Okay, we're done. That's it. We're good for the next 4 years, right? I would highly encourage you to find a way to make this something that you can have an ongoing conversation about. It doesn't have to be every month or every 5 months or anything like that, but periodically you need to be circling back. Hey, do we have any questions about this? Are there any dynamics we need to talk about? There is a lot of training and conversations out there. So just kind of wrapping up today, and then we've got a little bit of time for some questions if you guys have got them. I think I really want some of our takeaway today to be that it's difficult for our survivors to communicate effectively with communications for a variety of reasons. It makes the situation that they're in makes it very difficult for them to advocate for themselves sometimes, and sometimes even for them to really realize that what is occurring is wrong. And as the first step in the criminal justice system, we have an enormous responsibility to set the tone, right? We are the first responder. We are that first step. We are the people who get to tell them that we're glad that they're calling and that we're going to stay on the phone with them, that we're going to get them the help that they need. We're the ones who stay on the phone and reassure them. We are in the trenches with them. When our officers arrive, they bring the calm, but we are with them in the chaos. And so it's so helpful, I think, when we understand that, when we understand the trauma responses occurring, and when we understand how we can kind of walk alongside them as they're processing this. How do we get accurate information from our domestic violence victims? How do we get information that keeps them safe and keeps our community safe and keeps our first responders safe? Because at the end of the day, I think we all agree that that's one of our primary roles, right? We want people to stay safe. So if we can continue to do this, like if we can do this really well, like a real big win for us is not a victim cooperating with us 100%. For me, the win is them calling back next week when the abuse happens again, or them calling the week after that, or the week after that, the week after that, because I want them to keep calling us. Because if we can keep treating them with respect and compassion and patience, then we can slowly counteract what they've been told by their abuser. And one day, hopefully, they'll continue that help seeking to the point that they're able to get out, get safe, right? That's not our call to make. And it's not an easy one for them to make either. And so as we try and just create an environment where they can do that, I would encourage you guys to be, thinking about this in the context of how can we help give some additional context to our domestic or to our dispatchers so that they kind of know what it is that they're looking at. And so I want to thank you guys for listening. I know that was like a lot of talking in a really short amount of time, and I know we probably might have some questions. So, but thank you guys for listening. And I've also got my email there if anybody wants to reach out to me.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette. I've also gone ahead and included in the chat a link to the YouTube video that Jeanette was talking about earlier for Susan Still. It can be a difficult video to watch, but I think it's incredibly impactful. So if you guys have time, definitely go ahead and check that out. I'm also going to go ahead and add a link for next month's webinar. Next month, June 28th, we'll have Matt Harwell. He's the president of the Colorado NENA and APCO board. So definitely sign up for that one next month. I'm going to go ahead and also add my email in case anyone has any questions. For those of you that have been joining us in the past, I know that getting the certificates to you guys has kind of been an issue. Hopefully, we keep saying, hopefully it's fixed this time, and I think it is fixed this time. But if you don't get it by tomorrow, definitely send me an email, let me know. I work at 2 agencies, and I'm working on my master, so I know that for those of you that have messaged me before, it may take me a while to get back to you, but I will definitely get back to you. I'm also going to go ahead and share some information regarding the Denise Amber Lee Foundation's third-party quality assurance program and some of our on-site training in case any of you are interested. And again, if any of you have any questions, feel free to email me or info@deniseamberlee.org. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again, Jeanette, for taking the time to present to us.
Of course.
All right, thank you guys. Y'all have a great day.